There's one panelist that has not spoken yet, so I'm going to start with him, and then we're going to go around here, and that was Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell has a microphone a lot of the time, so I kind of purposely allowed others to speak, but I wanted to give you an opportunity before we went around the horn with the entire panel. Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Dex. Hard to follow all of that. I love these, by the way, because I feel like this has been the story of my 2 weeks of existence. My name is Travis, and at my house growing up, we have a shelf full of history books, old-timey Texas history books in particular. And my dad made a point to say from the very beginning that you're named after that man, William Barrett Travis. And I love my dad. And I was raised extremely proud of my name because I was named after the man that Travis County was named after and Lake Travis was named after. And it's my history. And when I hear about the Alamo and think of the Alamo, I think of the story my dad always told me that led him to name me Travis. And it was this image, which may or may not even be historically accurate, of William Barrett Travis pulling out his sword and drawing a line across the sand and saying to everyone, come across if you're willing to die so that we can create the Republic of Texas and defend it against the Mexican army, even at the cost of our own death and certain death. And I remember just feeling, just incredibly proud that was my history. Guess how many times I knew growing up that William Barrett Travis owned multiple slaves? I didn't even know. It wasn't something that was brought up. Guess how many times I heard what Ruben said earlier about when Texas was originally founded as a republic, an independent country. There were about 30-something registered slaves in the state of Texas, and within 30 years, there were 250,000 in large part, because the Congress, when they instituted the Republic of Texas, very intentionally made slavery legal and emancipation illegal. It was about slavery. And it just wasn't something I was taught much, that the state of Texas was not annexed into the United States initially because the powers that be were very concerned about overwhelming the country with pro-slave states. And that's why the Republic of Texas was put forward as a republic and not as a state. And why 30 years later, eventually they were annexed, because they were able to keep that balance of power through other states. For the first time in my life, I was embarrassed of the state flag of the state of Texas, a flag that I have loved my entire life. It's interesting to me because as a white person, I look back on Texas history fondly. And the reason is because when I think of stories like the Alamo, I put myself I see myself empathize with William Barrett Travis and Jim Bowie, a slave trader. That's who I see myself as. It's also difficult for me when I hear stories about lynching or cops, because I was raised to love the police, not to fear the police from day one. I have no idea what it means to fear the police intrinsically. I'm afraid if I'm speeding and I get pulled over, I get nervous. Sure, that's not what we're talking about here. I intrinsically know that the police are there to help me from the day I was born. And I've been pulled over and received plenty of tickets, even some here in the wonderful city of Kyle, Texas. It's been an interesting 2 weeks, hasn't it, Dex? I don't know if it was coronavirus that caused me to not be worrying so much about the Masters or baseball. I don't know if it was just the lack of events that I was preparing myself to go to, or the fact that I was in isolation for a long period of time. But when the story of and news of George Floyd broke, it was just different. I don't know how to explain it. We have this like head in the sand, but what about mentality? That's what white folks do. But what about the fact, you can I didn't get all the angles of it, or it's not institutional racism. It's just this off shot. It's the bad apple argument. It's the but what about argument. The fact that Texas is a pretty amazing state in a lot of ways. And those arguments are arguments that I've made. What about blue lives? What about all lives matter? Don't disrespect the flag when you kneel. All those conversations. I've said every one of those statements. I've made all of those statements. And at this time, I just realized, I think that the problem is not the Nazi, crazy, anarchist person caricature way out there. And that's why they're not the solution. The problem is in our own hearts, and it's in the way that we treat each other. It's in the way that we view our history and what lens we view it through. It's extremely raw and challenging for me to look back through our history and not try to see the history I want to see, but to see the history that is. And folks have talked to me a lot recently about, Kyle history, and I have learned and reread through a lot of Kyle's history in the last 2 weeks, as well as Texas history. It's just a little different than I remember reading it 4 or 5 years ago. All the facts are still there. Everything I read about the Claiborne log house and the log cabin and Fergus Kyle and the founding of Kyle and our German heritage, which is I have German heritage, so I identify with Mr. Kyle there. Those are the things that I was raised thinking about. And if you read the books, the slavery pieces are in there, but they're not the things that we don't feel it. We don't understand what it's like because we don't know what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And this has been, really one of the most profound couple weeks of my life. And because for the first time, I feel like not only myself, I'm certainly not unique, but a great many of the people in the white population have, for the first time, seen it differently, seen it through someone else's eyes. And my only prayer and hope is that this continues. I don't have the perfect sense of, the list of solutions. Gladys's demands were, I read through them all. I was trying frantically to write them down. I'm hoping we'll get an email of those.
I'm more than happy to provide
I would love to see it because I missed a few. They were all very good suggestions and things that we should really consider implementing. We have to lead because when you look back at our unpleasant history, I can't remember if it was I think maybe it was what Ben was saying, but my perspective on this is very much that it takes all of us coming together, recognizing the problem for what it is, and then thinking about the future that we want, and progressively and with all the courage we can muster, moving towards the future. When I think about our history, I think, what history do we want to celebrate? Because I've been accused of trying to tear down our history in the city of Kyle. And what I try to explain to people is, I don't want to tear down our history. I want to celebrate our history. Did you know that Kyle is known as the founding of the first commercially sold fajita? There's folks that know that. We need to celebrate those amazing parts of our history. Did you know that in 1995, we had an African-American elected as mayor who served for 10 years? And in 1995, the population of Kyle was 2,000 people. All these new folks coming in, these new progressive types, are not the people that put a black mayor in Kyle. It was the population of Kyle when it was 2,000 folks, the generational folks that put a mayor, a black mayor as a black man as their mayor. And we've had an African-American on council since then. And now we have another African-American leading us and showing us the way. Those are things that need to be celebrated. We need to create and celebrate Juneteenth more robustly than we ever have before. And I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have done it if I was the mayor without these things having happened, because Juneteenth was something I'd heard about in the back of my mind that I would hear, maybe see a little snippet on the news or something would scroll by, and I would have kind of a positive feeling towards it, but never even spend a lot of time thinking about the significance and the weight of the moment of when slavery was finally ended in the state of Texas 2.5 years after it was actually ended. Which just goes to show that we have to create the history that we want. We have to create that future and keep fighting, because it starts with laws and then it continues out, moving forward with courage and action and a willingness to stand up and speak out and listen. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.